Welcome, everyone, to the Average Ontario Anglers Fishing Podcast. This is the relatable fishing podcast in Ontario that is clean, no swearing, right, Andrew?
That's right.
It's so squeaky
Beep.
clean.
That's me.
It's so squeaky clean that you can listen to it in the car with your kids or even your old school grandma. So if you're new to the show,
Grandma.
How are you, Grandma? My grandma's dead.
Oh, mine too. Well,
Yeah.
depends what side of the family.
So if you're new to the show, I'm Jesse, your host today and the producer of the show. And this here with me is Andrew, our lovable, bearded comedic relief.
Thanks. I like how Jesse just assigned himself producer, which is correct. Don't get me wrong, but he's like, I now have a title.
Well, when you do 90% of the work, that's what you get. Anyway, so if you didn't know, me and Andrew are longtime fishing buddies. We've been fishing together over 2 decades. And this podcast, we're going to share with you everything that we've learned to help you become a better angler. So this information, though, I just would like to add for a little cool part at the beginning of this podcast. It's not just valuable to those that live in Ontario. You know, I've had a few people mention that, the name Average Ontario Anglers, it kind of sandbags us or pigeonholes us into people in Ontario just listening to it. And that may be true to a certain extent, but I was looking through some of our podcast analytics, and I'm going to tell you some interesting facts about the listeners of this podcast. So did you know that this podcast has listeners not only in all of Ontario, from Toronto to Thunder Bay, but also all across Canada? So we have listeners in so many places. I couldn't name them all, but we have listeners all the way from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Vancouver, British Columbia, and everywhere in between. Almost every province except for like Yellowknife. I guess that's not a province.
Not a province.
You know what I mean?
Now we'll never get them.
You know what I mean. So we have a lot of listeners from Edmonton, Montreal, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and a few other ones too. Now, the interesting thing is 10% of our listeners are actually not from Canada. They're from America, or the United States of America. So we actually have listeners in many places, and a lot of them are in Indiana, New York, California, Washington, Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and many other places. So if you're listening from one of those locations or from anywhere that I didn't mention, we really appreciate it.
So every week, friends.
Yeah, tell your American friends. So every week we get listeners from not only all over Canada and all over the United States, but we also get listeners from all over the world. So I'm going to name a few places. Yeah, I'm going to name a few places that we have listeners from every single week on our podcast. So we actually have people from Australia, Germany, Sweden, Kenya, New Zealand, Denmark, Finland, France, Italy, Poland, and Japan, and many more places. So we'd like to take this moment to thank everyone, wherever you're listening from. We'd like to thank you for listening and supporting our show. That's amazing. Whenever I look at the analytics, I'm like, yeah, there's some random guy or girl from Zimbabwe listening to fishing in Ontario. Like, I don't know. That's pretty cool. So that's pretty cool. But on a serious note, I'm a little disappointed. You know why? We have so many listeners every week, and we expect way more reviews from you people. Come on. I mean, there's a lot of reviews. We thank you if you have, but for the amount of listeners that we have, it's a small fraction of the reviews that we've actually got. So if you have time, I know people are busy and they always forget. I forget all the time. But if you do have a few minutes, make sure to give us a star rating on Spotify or type out a review on Apple, or give us a rating on whatever streaming service that you're using. We really appreciate it. It helps us rank higher, helps us get bigger giveaways, and it helps you guys in the long run. So we do appreciate that. Now, this episode it's a pretty cool one. We're going to have the first ever AOA Q&A in depth. We're going to go in depth on a bunch of questions that we got from our Patreon members and Instagram followers. Not 2 minutes of, talk on each question. We're going to go in depth on these questions because we always have people ask us questions, and some of the questions are really good. And I feel bad just being like, you know what? We can't just talk about this for 30 seconds, but maybe the topic isn't deep enough that we can spend a whole episode on it, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to go in depth. We had so many questions, actually really good questions. Like, I'm always surprised. I always say that. Like, oh, we got really good questions this week, but you guys did not disappoint. So we're going to go through, first of all, our Patreon members' questions, and then we're going to go through our Instagram as well. But before we do that, we actually have An interesting fishing fact, and to handle that, we have the man with the mustache and the beard, Andrew.
You gotta start calling me just the man with the beard and the mustache, because the beard's it's growing a lot longer than the mustache.
We all know that the beard isn't a beard. Andrew's mustache grew so big that it just enveloped the rest of his face. None of that hair is attached to his chin.
I just part it.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about fish. How fish. Well, I want to talk about fish. Okay. That's smart, Andrew. It's a fishing podcast. I want to talk about how fish get into new bodies of water, specifically ponds. Like, how many times have you gone fishing, or how many times have I dragged you up a beaver dam into another like pond up above and like, hey, let's try fishing here? And then how many times does it absolutely stink?
Usually a lot.
But then how many times are we fishing by a creek and we're fishing a pond over there and we're like, let's just take a few casts, and it's like an amazing, bluegill pond or something like that, or you get some catfish. Like, it's some cool fish that are just stuck in a pond that you wouldn't expect to find up beside a trout creek or something.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, or doing some research as to how do fish actually start in new areas. I have some that are scientifically proven, and I have some that are scientifically disproven, but still kind of fun, so we're going to entertain the idea. The first one is going to be natural methods of fish dispersal. So think of like flooding in waters. Whenever water levels rise, let's say it's a pond that has fish in it already that someone stocked, and it floods and it goes into a creek, or it goes into another kind of pond nearby. Some of those fish are gonna find their way, or it floods over its bank into a nearby creek. Fish might come in from the creek into that pond. So whenever things like that happen, whenever flooding happens, fish tend to move around a lot. I mean, we've all seen the videos of fish like swimming across roads and stuff like that, right? Like,
Yeah.
they'll move where there's water. In fact, in the Amazon basin, there are fish species that regularly move between bodies of water whenever there's the rainfall, like the big rain season. They commonly do so, like catfish and carp. They travel long distances between these like known lakes over areas that would never be able to be traversable by them normally. Another one, and I'm sure you've heard this one, Jesse, when people say, "Oh, how do fish get into ponds?" And you might have heard that like birds will carry them there. Yeah. And growing up, I heard, like, I'm thinking, okay, like an osprey is carrying something and drops it. I don't know about you. I've maybe once seen an osprey drop a fish and it went down and got it again. Like, they don't just like, oops, I dropped one. Like, that's their livelihood. But it's actually not the whole fish, it's the eggs. So if you have fertilized fish eggs, let's say by a heron specifically, is what they've actually have found. I saw a few articles that say this has never been proven, and then I found evidence of a 2019 study that showed that fish eggs could survive a trip through the digestive tract of ducks. It's not a high probability, but ducks, when they're feeding on the weeds and stuff like that, which is where fish are going to be spawning, they could ingest some eggs, and the eggs could make it all the way through, and when the ducks have landed in another pond, bloop, 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 like Boba Tea, start spitting out these these fish eggs, and they could hatch. Another one is it could be perhaps getting caught on some of the feathers of the legs. That is a theory to have, like the herons, let's say, where the heron is feeding in the shallow water, weedy water, and that's again where fish will have spawned, and they might get some fish eggs stuck to their feathers or to their feet or whatnot, and they fly to another area, and they're going to be feeding in a very similar area, in a shallow, weedy area. So it could be an opportune time for, if it's not too far of a distance, those eggs could stay moist enough to still be viable. Again, very slim odds, but there is a chance. Another one is watercourses, rivers, streams, and groundwater. So a normal stream that's constantly flowing, if a fish can get into it, it'll just move up and down streams. Even if, like we said, rain, the stream will grow big enough that a fish can now traverse it. But during the summer, it might dry out to just a little trickle. But it could make their way through there. But even underwater rivers, things like freshwater springs can actually bring fish from one body of water to another. I would have to say the biggest one, though, would be obviously our involvement, humans. Because you look at all the fish species we have in Ontario, but around the world, a lot of them, especially in the Americas, are not native to the Americas, or at least not to the areas that were commonly found. And that's because for over 100 years now, we've been stocking all these different areas with fish. But what about the unintentional release? So we always have the reminders of, empty out your bilge pump, make sure you wipe off your boat. Your boat has to be clean before moving from one body of water to another. And things like that. Again, if you're going through, you could have weeds caught with fish eggs, and they could be released from one to another. Another big one we talked about is like aquarium dumping. So if you have a pet fish, people release them. We even had some, like the ball nipper or goldfish, and they are in our Great Lakes. They have been found. They have been caught because people have released them. And the only way they'd get here, because there's no surrounding native population of them, is that people release them in there. And let's get to the fun ones. Theoretical and unproven hypotheses.
Do they involve Bigfoot?
Well, they could, because Bigfoot could be wading through the water, get fish eggs stuck on his fur, and then walk into the next pond over. So,
true.
Yeah, any mammal absolutely could. This one, though, cuts out the middleman. Forget things and animals and creatures carrying it from one place to another. What if it was just air? What if the wind picked up a bunch of fish eggs and just like blew it over to the next pond over? A big storm comes by. Maybe.
Like a water spout?
Yeah, that would be a lot. To have like a water spout hit a spawned area of water and suck up the eggs. Like, fish have rained from the sky before, like whole fish. Yeah, but that's primary. If you go and fish a pond, you're like, I wonder how these got here. I can pretty much guarantee you the answer is not a water spout.
But it's possible.
Then you have spontaneous generation theory. I was like, what is this? I'm going to read this exactly how I found it. There's a long-standing folk belief that fish can simply appear out of nowhere in bodies of water. This idea, once popular in ancient times, is called spontaneous generation, suggesting that fish can somehow form out of non-living matter in the mud or water. Of course, modern science has debunked this theory.
I wonder how.
But it's still an interesting reflection on how people once tried to explain fish dispersal before they understood biology. And a lot of these things, there's been maybe one or two scientific studies that show it's possible that this could be the way that they've moved from one body to the water. It's possible eggs could pass its way through a duck and still be viable.
Yeah.
It's possible that mammals are walking through the water and leaving it there. But not always. It kind of leads into this next fact, which is no longer about how fish get places, but why don't fish get certain places? So we talked about some beaver ponds. They don't have anything in there. Why do some beaver ponds not have fish? Like, there's been places where we fish the lake and it's full of fish. And then 6 inches up over a beaver dam, there's nothing at all on this nice big like inland lake.
Remember that place we went? It's like,
Andrew
dragged me up this hill. It was a pretty big hill. We dragged the canoe up, all of our fishing gear. We slid into this beaver pond. It was beautiful. Like, it was one of those places you're like, I guarantee I'm going to catch a bass on the first cast. We saw literally nothing, no bites. We didn't even see a minnow.
So why do you think that might be, Jesse?
Originally, I think it has something to do with like the pH level or some like mineral content in the water. Some rotting plants, some kind of, I don't know, the water is like toxic basically.
If it's a recently flooded area, a lot of the rotting vegetation and trees and stuff that's in the water, that can prevent fish from wanting to be in there. Even just the beaver dam itself, there are so few fish that can actually cross up a beaver dam. And you think, you see trickling water. We see salmon launch themselves, 6 feet up a waterfall and narrowly miss bear mouths, and they somehow make it up. But salmon, that's a rare thing for a fish to be able to do, is to actually migrate up over top of moving water like that. So things like minnows, which you might expect maybe they could wiggle their way through, they can't get through beaver dams. So right at the bottom of the food chain for fish, they can't get there. Another one is water temperature. We know oftentimes it's shallow. Oxygen levels, like you're saying, a lot of rotting growth or whatnot in there will reduce the amount of oxygen. One thing I never thought of was the predation and the habitat. Is it suitable? Because we think and we look, oh, there's a bunch of weeds. That's awesome. There's some deep spots. This could be perfect. Why aren't bass here? This is what I would look for in a lake. But lakes also have large areas without weeds. They also have large areas, large shallow areas where it's more spread out. When something gets so choked with weeds, the fish have a very hard time surviving there. And it's also most likely going to be filled with, logs and whatnot, and otters, other predators who eat fish, love that. So it could just be the odd fish that gets in there, it just gets eaten quickly. But that's what I want to talk about. That's kind of ends the scenario. But the cool thing about that to take away is you never know.
I was just thinking,
I always love trying those things because we've found a couple ponds that have been really cool, and I think we're going to talk about one later, honestly.
Yeah.
But there are some that they look better than that pond, and they don't hold a thing.
Yeah. I was just thinking of Jeff Goldblum on Jurassic Park when he has his shirt off, and he's like, "Life finds a way."
And then when you catch that bass, you turn into the other guy. Clever girl.
That's actually funny because next week's interesting fishing fact is about an introduced species into a new lake. Ooh. That's a little cliffhanger for you, but that was a great interesting fishing fact. It is true because oftentimes there's, big lakes, there's fish in there, but all these, you look at the map of Ontario and you zoom out and there's all these little lakes everywhere. I mean, like there's 250,000 lakes in Ontario probably, and there's probably more that aren't even considered lakes because they're too small, like ponds. And a lot of them have fish in them. You're like, how the heck did fish get in there? But yeah, some birds are pretty smart, right? Here's my theory. Some birds are pretty smart. Ospreys, they get a little bit like gangs, right? Like gang members, like the mob, right? So they don't like being around each other. They're like, this is my turf. So one smart osprey gets a fish. It catches a fish that has eggs in it. And then it catches another fish that has male things in it. And it flies them to another lake. It tries not to kill them, just to maim them slightly. And it drops them into the lake, its own little love lake. And that lake is his own area. So he's literally like a matchmaking osprey. And now he has his own little lake full of fish that no other osprey knows about.
So Jesse is hypothesizing an aerial aviary Noah. Taking two of each kind and dropping them in little arc-like lakes.
Hey, it's possible. That's more possible than a fish materializing from like rotten weeds and snail shells on the bottom of a lake.
Hey, our ancestors believed that.
Our ancestors were dumb. So anyway, thanks for that interesting fishing fact, Andrew. So as I mentioned, this week we're going to do an AOA Q&A, which is one of our favorite type of episodes because we get to answer and questions from our listeners, as well as sometimes they just ask us our opinion on things because some of our listeners, they know everything already. But anyway, we're going to go a little bit more in depth on some of these. A lot of questions we get, like I said, they're great questions. Definitely need more than a minute or two to cover them, but not enough for a full episode. So this is a great episode. In fact, just a spoiler alert, this episode is so long that it is going to be a part 1 and part 2, which I've had many people ask. They're like, you can do longer episodes, guys. I could listen to you guys forever. I'm like, that's cool. But you realize that it takes a long time to edit these things. So don't expect this all the time. But anyway, here's our first question. So we're going to go through some of them. Me and Andrew are going to go and, take which one we think is cool. So I'll read the first one. This one is from Niagara Inspired, who is one of our Patreon members. So thank you for that. His question is, you mentioned previously that you like to bring all the tackle you own to a new body of water. He says, I'm guilty also. Can you walk us through your preparation rituals when it comes to new areas? Now, we don't bring all the tackle we own because that would mean we would need a floating barge. But we do bring a lot of tackle. You are right. So that's a good question because I feel like a lot of people may, if they're just getting into the sport or if they're targeting a new species or a new lake, that's a question that a lot of people may have. That's a question that I have every time I go fishing. Like, how easy of an ordeal is it for you, Andrew, when I say, oh, we're going to fish this new lake tomorrow? are you like, I'll be ready in 5 minutes, or are you going to take, an hour?
Well, like it says preparation rituals. The first thing I do is I draw a big circle on the ground with like a star inside of it. And I put 7 tackle boxes around it.
Not that kind of ritual.
Sprinkle some pike slime around. It's tough because when there's places where we're fishing out of a small craft, and again, the canoe is great, but I want to go fishing off out of a paddleboard soon and stuff like that. And I definitely can't bring my tackle box on the paddleboard. I can't bring more than 1 rod on my paddleboard. So things like that, it's a lot of research to look in first, as much information as I can glean. So if it's an area I've never been in, I'll look at Google Maps and I'll see. You can tell pretty good from Google Maps if it's going to be a very weedy lake or not. Usually you can do pretty good at judging that with a bit of experience and first look at some areas that what they look like midsummer, then look at Google Maps and see what it looks like. Because oftentimes they take those pictures in like the early spring where there's not as much weed growth on the lake. So but you can usually see a greenish hue in the water and stuff, and you'll know, okay, that's pretty shallow. That's going to be full and choked with weeds. When I get that, at least I can cut out some things, hopefully.
Yeah. I like to watch YouTube videos too. So like sometimes if I'm looking at a new lake and it's not like a little back lake that no one knows about, and I've never been there. Like for instance, I fished this lake up near Ottawa last year. Had no idea what I was faced with. All I knew was there's some walleye, there's pike, there's some musky, there's bass. Like I didn't know anything about it. And I watched some YouTube videos that someone uploaded, and it just gave me an idea of the area. And I'm like, okay, not a lot of weeds, lots of rocks, lots of timber. Okay. And then I could pack accordingly. So like I might not pack like a whole box of weedless frogs. I might just bring 2, and it'll help you if you know what you're dealing with. Like Andrew said, it'll really help you bring tackle that you actually will use and not waste space with stuff that you won't need.
Yeah. So I think most of the stuff too, like I have a lot of my lures narrowed down to, I cast like 5 of them mainly, right?
Yeah.
Like we usually find we use the same lure. So no matter where I'm going, I'm going to have those with me. And so all I'm looking then for to bring on top of that, on top of my, my chatterbait, my soft plastic paddle tail, and like the things that are like tried and true, I would then look at, okay, if I have any more information, even looking at Google Maps, if it's, let's say it's a park or something like that, people have photos of them camping or being there or paddling along. And it may not be many fishing photos, but again, it gets me kind of an idea of maybe what's there in the area, maybe a spot I'd want to try, and you look in the background of the photo, like, that's a cool rocky bay. Like, okay, and I'm going to try and bring, a spinnerbait because I want to do it here. I saw some rice in the photo over there. So I'm going to bring a couple things that I want to try. But I have my go-to box that is pretty versatile. The stuff I use most of the time are already versatile baits that I can use around. So by the end of it does take me a while, but it's mainly just picking out things that I want to experiment with on that lake.
Yeah. And I think because we fish out of smaller crafts, we're pretty good at jamming everything we need into one tackle box. So like, I know a lot of people, like I fish with my buddy Rob in his boat, and he has so many trays just lined up. Like, I mean, it's a big boat and he has all the storage in his boat, and his boat is basically a massive tackle box, which is great. That's amazing. I wish I had that, but I can't bring 19 trays of everything that I own when I go fishing. So over the years of, fishing backcountry, when you're literally just in a small canoe or a small tin boat, you can't bring multiple tackle boxes with you. I mean, you could, but you can't really. So we have gotten adept to bringing, I'd say like basic lures. Like last week we talked about the Ned rig. Pretty much if you're bass fishing and you're not fishing a super weedy lake, a Ned rig is something that you can chuck all day long and catch fish on. Or like a chatterbait. We always talk about chatterbaits, how good they are. That is going to be in my box, guaranteed, where I'm going to fish. So there's baits that once you start fishing a lot, I know Niagara Inspired, the guy fishes a lot anyway, but he knows you have confidence lures that you can fish anywhere, and you're going to pack those anyway. So I know it's complicated, but basically don't overthink and don't try to bring too much stuff. Try to do a little research, like Andrew said, look at some photos, watch some YouTube videos, talk to people too. I've had people ask me like, hey, I'm not looking for spots, but I'm looking to fish this lake. Is there any lures you'd recommend, or what should I look for? I'm happy to tell them, what I know about the lake. No problem. Are we going to hand out spots? No, we're not. But most people are happy enough to tell you, like, yeah, you know what? It's great for frogs, or, make sure you bring, a football jig,
The Great Lake, watch out for all the logs,
Yeah. I lost a prop there last year. So anyway, yeah, it can get pretty crazy bringing too much tackle, but what we've learned over the years is you don't need to bring half as much as you think you do. And generally, we always use probably the same 5 lures when we're fishing generally. I mean, there's always those days when you're glad you brought some extra stuff because it was something you needed, but I'd say like 75% of the time you never touch the other stuff. So don't go crazy. So here's a question from Big Dog. I don't know his guy's name, but he's apparently a big dog from Patreon. So he says, what are each of your 3 most memorable favorite catches in a watercraft? Doesn't have to be the biggest catches. It's more about the memory and the story behind the catch that I'm curious about. That's a good question. I thought we have 4. I didn't want to do 3.
I do have an extra one too.
Okay, we have 5. So why don't you do your first one first?
So the salmon, and we've talked about it before, but it's such a good story. We're going to say it again. We were fishing out of my canoe down on one of the harbors on the Great Lakes, on Lake Ontario, for the salmon when they were coming in the fall. Now again, the canoe that I have is not the Sports Pal. I have an Algonquin canoe, and it's nice. It's a portage style canoe, so it's not as stable as a Sports Pal, but it's still light and way nicer for backcountry camping and stuff. Paddle around it. So Jesse had caught a few salmon out of that canoe. We've been fishing it a couple years, and I've been skunked every time fishing in the canoe. I never caught a salmon. I'm like, I need to catch, like Jesse, this year I'm catching a salmon out of my canoe. And it was one of our first times out that year, I think, in that canoe. I think it was our second time out, I think, that year.
Yeah.
And it was funny because we were talking with Matt Savea, who owns Kitefish beads and stuff, right? So we were talking to him beforehand, and we're saying, like, I'm gonna catch a salmon this year, and he fishes the same area. So he's like, oh, I'm gonna be there, and I'm gonna net it for you. It's gonna be awesome, man. We're gonna do it. So Jesse and I go fishing, and we went after work, and we forgot our net. And we're like, you know what? We can't drive back. Let's just go. We have lip grippers. We'll be all right. We can handle it. Be smart about it. And we're trolling around, and I finally hook into a salmon, and it doesn't throw the hook in the first 3 seconds on me. So I'm good.
That's a rarity for Andrew.
Yeah. So we're reeling this thing in, going for the old salmon sleigh ride. And wouldn't you know it, Matt is out there that same night, paddling his kayak around. And we start hooting and hollering because we realize this is a big salmon. It's come up to the boat. We're like, that's huge. And so we're yelling at Matt, bring over. Do you have a net? He's like, yeah. Like, bring your net. We need your net. So he comes over. We get it up. He nets the fish from his kayak. He fulfilled his own self-fulfilling prophecy. He netted that salmon, and when we weighed it, our scale maxed out at 25 pounds, and the tail was like a good section of the back end of that salmon is still in the water. Oh, I wouldn't say it was 30, but it was approaching. It was definitely high 20s.
It was a solid. I wouldn't even say it. I'd say it could have been a 30 for sure. Yeah. It was a giant fish. We have a picture of the thing, and it's a big fish. Like, we've caught a lot of kings off the pier and off the harbor in our time, but that was
that thing had stretch marks.
One of the bigger ones. Like, yeah, it was big.
It's still to this date my PB salmon, and it was also my first salmon in a canoe, and the first salmon in that canoe. So it's a pretty special story to have that.
Yeah, actually, I don't know why you said you were adding one, because that's the first one I have written down. It says Andrew Salmon /
That's not
canoe.
the one I added. I have another one.
Oh. Okay, I'll do the next one. So the next one is actually just happened this year. We like fishing for pike. Everyone, knows that, in the early spring is a good time to catch the big female northern pike because they're going into spawn. What happens is, in the zone that we like to fish, it actually closes for the month of April because the big pike spawn in April. So they're protecting the spawn because they're really swarmed into the shallows. It's a bit too easy to catch them, not very sportsmanlike. So they close the season. So what happens is, in March, late February and March, the water's ice cold. In fact, usually in March, early March, the bays that we like to fish for these fish are still frozen. but it was a unseasonably warm spring as usual. It's kind of the trend now in Ontario. And these bays were open. It was March. It was the third day of March, which is the earliest I've ever got out in the sports pal. It was a bit crazy. But we went out there in the sports pal.
What was the water temps that day? It was 30,
38.
what? 38?
Yeah.
I think it was 36 in parts. But
yes.
the average was, like 30. I think we hit one spot that was, 40. There's one little spot that was like a warm spot.
So legitimate ice cold. Like you would not want to get in the water. Now, a sports pal, it is a canoe, but it's flat bottom. It's super wide at the back. The odds of falling in, if you're careful, are very low.
And again, we didn't wear life jackets all the time, but we also don't stand.
Yeah.
We weren't standing then.
Well, we were wearing life jackets the whole time.
No, I'm saying we were, but I mean, we normally in the summer we'll stand up and like pitch from the and stuff like that. Because the water is so cold, we're extra safe. We're don't even bother standing.
Yeah. So anyway, it was freezing cold. It was a little bit windy. We had a few little follows of little pike, so we're like, oh, okay, they're in here. Our hands were getting ice cold, and then I was chucking. I think Andrew was chucking a chatterbait. I was chucking a fire tiger jerkbait. We were just about to pack it in, and Andrew caught this pike. It wasn't a big one, but it was a beautiful pike. Had a big fat belly on it. It was a little female. I think like what, high 20-inch.
Yeah, I think it was close to 30. I think it may have been 30.
So we got some pictures of that, and that kind of like fueled us on to keep going for a little bit, even though our hands were freezing. So Andrew caught this nice fish, and then I had a jerkbait rod, like a bass jerkbait rod, like a medium light jerkbait rod, 10-pound test. I'm fishing this fire tiger jerkbait, and I'm snapping it through about, I'd say 6-7 feet of water, and all of a sudden I'm snapping it, and then I snap down my rod, and it just like stops. And there is some snags in there, so I'm like, oh, I snagged something.
There's also carp, which we've snagged into before in there.
We have snagged into carp when fishing for pike. Yeah. So I'm just pulling on this, and it's not moving at all. Again, I'm using a whippy medium light jerkbait rod. And the canoe is kind of moving as I'm pulling. When you're in a canoe or a kayak and you're pulling on your rod and the canoe's kind of moving. And I'm like, Andrew, I got a snag. Let's turn around. And he's like, is it moving? And the line was slowly moving. And he's like, I think you snagged a carp. And I start pulling on the rod, and all of a sudden the fish starts moving faster, and it just goes like instantly like 30 feet quick to the side. And I was like, oh man, I snagged a carp, man. And I'm fighting this thing. I'm like, I don't want to lose my jerkbait. It's like a nice Japanese jerkbait. And then it comes to the surface, and I just see this like red tail.
Yeah.
Like a pike tail.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my God, it's a huge pike. It's a huge pike. And Andrew's like looking like, oh man, comes up. I'm fighting this thing so gingerly because I'm using 10-pound test.
As soon as we confirmed it was a pike by that tail coming up,
like
my rod, when Jesse's fighting, I have my rod, I reeled in quick, put it away. I started taking the paddle, and I'm like turning the canoe.
Yes.
Because the thing's swimming circles around us.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get Jesse like to stay on the bow, with him.
I felt like it was the Jaws movie because the fish was going far away. So I had the trolling motor like on maximum reverse to like keep up with the fish as I'm trying to reel in slackline. So anyway, we fought the thing so gingerly. It came up beside the boat. It came up, and I was like, this thing is huge. And we finally, Andrew stuffed it in the net, and it was hooked pretty not super good. So I'm surprised
there's one treble left in it.
Yeah. So we got that thing in the net, and we measured it. It was 37.5 inches, which was any pike over 36 in my book is a good fish. It wasn't quite that 40-inch that we're all looking for, but it was a giant pike. It was huge. It was fat, and it was like the third day of March. And our hands were shaking. We were all like shaking. We released it. It swam away. Hopefully, had a good spawn, and hopefully we'll see it again next spring. But yeah, that for me was just like an epic day because like here's this huge fish. We're fishing this bay, like close to our house, and legit catch a really good pike, and it was just amazing. Anyway, that was a good story.
Another one for a long time, not for a long time, I guess for that year is my PB musky. It's still, I would have to say, my favorite musky story. It was, we were fishing out of the sports pal. Actually, no, my first musky was out of my canoe.
Yep.
So I had never been musky fishing before. Jesse, I think, had caught a couple just on accident while bass fishing. Like, you never really targeted them effectively, at least.
No.
In the past. So he's like, let's try and get into musky fishing this year. And it was the first time we tried. We didn't have the sports pal yet. So again, we're in my canoe, my 16-foot portage style canoe. And I didn't have any musky baits. I had a heavy action spinning rod. No, I had my it was a medium heavy bait casting rod.
Yep.
And I was long lining a J13. I'm like, this is big enough bait. Like, all right. And it's getting close, end of summer or early fall. And we're paddling along. I might have had I don't remember if I had the trolling motor on my like homemade transom or not. But we're just slowly going up and down this river. And nothing. Like all day. We don't know what we're doing. We're like, oh, I heard there might be some up here. And we just like went 45 minutes upriver. Saw nothing, did nothing. We're just trolling. That's all we did. Because we didn't know how to fish for them effectively by casting by any means. And so then we were trolling back, and I think we stopped for some reason, and I can't remember why we stopped. We had a sandwich or something, and I set my rod down. I just left the line behind me because we're just drifting down. The lure's going to drift down the same speed as us. Who cares? We'll just continue trolling in a bit. I go to pick up my rod to reel in because the line had kind of drifted off to the side. So I'm like, okay, I'll reel in. I'll just cast behind the boat again, and we're about to start. I had to reel in. There's weight on the rod. I'm like, J13's float. What did I snag on? So I start pulling on it as if it's a snag, and all of a sudden it shoots sideways. And it was my first musky, and I got a 39-inch musky, and the net we had was like a bass net. Like it was like folded in half trying to get in the net, and put the lip grippers on it so get it out of that net because it was not a good net for a muskie. But that was my first muskie ever. So again, my portage canoe has got me some, at the time that was my PB. Again, 39-inch muskie is nothing to sneeze at. And for a PB salmon out of that canoe, where it's designed for fishing like small trout back lakes, I think we put it through its paces.
Oh yeah. One other story, which was in Andrew's portage canoe, we fished this little pond that we had seen off one of the highways that we go up fishing at different lakes. For years, we saw this pond, and it's not big. It's small. I'd say it's the size of a football field, even smaller than that.
If that.
Half the size of a football field. It's tiny. And for years, we see this little pond. We're like, oh man, I want to fish that one day. And it never really came about because it's such a small pond. We didn't think there would be anything in it. One day we went fishing, and on the way home from a camping trip, we left early, and Andrew's like, we have 5 hours to kill. Why don't we hit that pond? So we're like, what the heck? So we figured out how to get there. We portaged the canoe in, we dropped it in. As soon as we put the canoe in, first cast with a frog, fish blew up on it, and we were just like, ooh.
It was like a 3-pound largemouth. It was the first fish out of this pond.
And in, I'd say 2 hours, we caught 2 4-pounders, probably like 5 3-pounders, and like enough 2 and 1-pounders. Like it was insane. I think we probably caught 25 bass in this pond.
The one you caught was close to 5 pounds. It was a high 4. It was a donkey,
and all on topwater frogs. It was just like a weed choked pond, but deep in the middle, very deep. I'd say like 10 feet in the middle.
Yeah,
it was like an old farmer's pond or something, but it was choked with largemouth and crappie. That's it. No sunfish, nothing else. And giant fish. And it was like these fish had never seen a lure before. So you chuck a frog out, as soon as it hit the water, boom, fish blew up on it. You'd release it, next cast, boom, you'd catch another. It was insane. And that was the only good day we had at that pond. We went back a few other times, and long story short, I think a lot of other people started fishing it because when we started fishing it, it was pristine. And then the next year we went back, there was some garbage, there's some bait packages around and not as many fish. And then I saw more people fishing there. And then eventually I saw people keeping fish out of there. And then we went back and I think it got fished out. But
we talked a bit about with Adam Merrifield, like he was talking about rivers, but on a pond, like, yes, it is in the zone to keep whatever possession limit or legal limit. But as soon as a couple people start doing that in a pond, you're really going to hurt the population. So Jesse and I, whenever we fished it or whenever we fish small bodies of water like that, it's always catch and release only for us. But yeah, that was kind of a sad story to look at how fast it was affected by not illegal but unethical fishing.
Yeah, right? And that really goes to show.
Yeah,
a lot of people get mad and be like, "Why won't people give out fishing spots? Anglers should be helping other anglers." Yes, we'll give spots that are good for fishing, but little secret spots like that quickly get overfished and destroyed. You can understand now why anglers are tight-lipped sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, you have another quick story?
Yeah, so I was back up at the cottage recently, and it made me, I was thinking of my different cottage experiences back in the day. And we had talked before how, in previous questions on this podcast, people ask, what are your fondest memories, or how did you get into fishing? And I loved going fishing with my grandpa up at the cottage. And I remember we talked a little bit last time I mentioned him, how he's very, very old school. So I went fishing with him one morning. I'm out there, and I've been reading my scientific angler fishing books, and me and Jesse, we're looking at Bass Pro Shops catalog, we're looking at all our stuff, and I think I'm all that in a bag of rocks, I know exactly what I'm going to do to catch fish on this cottage river. And we go out. I've got, I think, 2 or 3 rods, and all the rods I owned at the time. And I'm out there, and I'm trying to cast all these fancy new lures and all that stuff. And then there's Grandpa, and he takes his one rod, which is this, like, I don't know, 60-year-old Mitchell rod. And it's got blue strand line on it, like super coily. And he pulls his tackle box. I have my big Bass Pro my 370 tackle box already, and it's like getting stuffed to the gills already at that point. Grandpa brought his tackle box, which consisted of a wine cork in his shirt pocket that had 3 jigs on it, lead head, like ball head jigs. One was green, one was red, and one was yellow. He had 0 soft plastics. And he ties on a jig, takes it out of the cork, puts the cork back in his pocket, and he just drops her over the side of the boat. And he just starts jigging. And I'm like, I can do this. I'm fishing spinners, I'm fishing spoons, I'm fishing crankbaits and all this stuff. And I caught the first fish, and I caught a rock bass. Nothing fancy about it. It was like a 1/4 pound. It was a small one. I'm like, all right, yeah, I caught first fish. And then Grandpa all of a sudden is like, oh, there's one. He starts reeling in. I go, oh, it's a pickerel. And brings up, catches a walleye. I'm like, I haven't got a walleye in the river. Drops back down, keeps fishing. There's one. He catches a small bass on a bare jig, like a bare ball head jig. I don't know what action he's giving it underwater. He caught 5 fish, and I only caught that one rock bass. But that story, it encouraged me to. Sometimes you got to simplify. Like, yeah. There he is with literally none of the stuff that I thought was the most important stuff to have. And he was out fishing me like nuts. 5-1. He outfished me. And it just was impressive to me to see that. And it wasn't even like he knew the spots. He's like, go where you want. I was just paddling around, and he was still out fishing me on spots that I wanted to fish. So that was a very fond memory for me. But I always love, and whenever I bring people up to the cottage, I'll take them to that spot and tell them that story.
Good old Grandpa. Seems like everyone's grandpa's the best angler ever, but here's our next question. Uncle Brian Carrot asks us this question. He says, what species are you planning in targeting most this fall, and why? How about you, Andrew?
Musky. Just like that picture in the back. I want to catch musky.
Hear this? This is a tube jig. A big tube jig.
This is a big tube jig too. Just the burbot tube.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that later a bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, for us, it's musky. Actually, all the trips planned. So this weekend when this podcast comes out, I'll be up at a cottage musky fishing for 4 days. After that, me and Andrew have a musky trip up near North Bay planned. And then after that, we're actually going on a trip to another musky trip in some lake. And then after that, we have a trip planned on St. Clair, which we're super excited about. We're hoping to catch a giant 50-inch. Yeah. So really for us, it's all musky. In the fall, like we always say, there's so many different fish to fish for in Ontario. In the fall, it's great for bass, it's great for salmon, all these other fish. You really have to decide what you personally are interested in catching. I grew up fishing for salmon. I fished, countless days every week when I was, in high school. or a single fishing for salmon in the fall, but I just don't do it a lot nowadays. Not that I don't enjoy it. I've moved on to other things. I find musky fishing more interesting right now. Not to say that we won't try to get out salmon fishing, but we have to prioritize what we're obsessed with at the time. Life is too short to fish for the same fish year after year, Jesse said, fishing for musky every year and not catching anything. So anyway, musky. Hopefully we catch. We're going to try to beat our PBs this fall, and since we're going to St. Clair, that probably will happen pretty easily. Here's another question from Ted Williams. And if you didn't know Ted Williams, he's the guy who composed our epic intro. Thanks again, Ted. So he's a Patreon member as well, so appreciate that. So his question is, unfortunately, some of our lakes here in Alberta are susceptible to harsh algae blooms. Last weekend, I was at a new lake that seemed to be going through a pretty serious bloom. I was looking to harvest a fish, but was pretty nervous to bring one home to eat in the midst of the algae bloom. With this in mind, would you recommend holding off until the bloom is clear, or is it something that I wouldn't need to worry about? Now, I got some information from the Ontario website. I didn't find anything on the Alberta website. Apparently, Ontario is more of an expert on algae blooms. So, Andrew's an expert on fungus and algae, so I'll let him read that.
I am not, but I'll do my best. So it says that eating fish caught during a blue-green algae bloom specifically, there's a low risk to human health. And if you eat fish caught during those conditions, it shows that the cyanotoxin and microcystin does not accumulate at high levels in the fish fillet. So in the meat of the fish, it doesn't permeate into the meat to cause any issue of consuming it. Now it says one exception is that higher levels of microcystins have been found in the livers of fish from water bodies that regularly have blue-green algae blooms, even when a bloom is not present. Avoid eating any fish organs to eliminate this risk. Now, so I'm not sure what Ted Williams likes to eat out of a fish, but I'm hoping it's mainly just the fleshy meat bits and not the organs of the fish. Otherwise, I would suggest from what is described here, especially if it's a blue-green algae bloom. If it's a red algae bloom or something, who knows? Maybe that's some weird other thing that's happening. Maybe don't risk it.
Yeah.
But if it's a lake that usually has this algae bloom, again, the liver can have a higher concentration, but the meat itself should be safe to eat.
Yeah. And you know how they always say, why would anyone eat this? Well, they obviously put this because some people do eat fish organs. So I don't know. I don't personally, but some people probably do. So that's why they wrote it. So again, take this with a grain of salt. Don't be on your deathbed in the hospital being like, AOA said it was okay. We don't want to hear that. Here's a question from James. He says, looking to catch my first Kawartha muskie this fall. Any suggestions for baits to get started? Nothing too big. That's a great question. Again, we've been catching muskie for years, but we just started seriously targeting them in the last 5 years, 5 or 6 years, I'd say. So I'd say one of the best overall baits for any time of year for muskie, if you're just getting into it, is this bait right here. This is a Water Wolf Lures Shadzilla Jr. Now, to describe this bait, it's a 7-inch swim bait. It has a single hook coming out of the top like a jig hook, and it has a treble hook hanging off the bottom near the head. Now, muskie generally and pike, they usually headshot baits. So they come from the side and grab the head. So usually you hook them on that treble hook. I find, I think I can not even remember any fish that I've caught on the top hook on that. Usually they just headshot it and they get that treble hook in. It's not a huge bait. They're about 3 ounces at most. So you don't need a huge rod to cast these. You can use, a swim bait rod for bass, or you can use like a medium heavy musky rod. They're a great bait. Cast and retrieve. That's all you have to do. They're great. You can fish them at different depths. You can count them down. You can fish them shallow. If you are fishing over weeds, I have taken the treble hook off and just fished it through weeds quick, and you'll still catch them. Pike love them too. If you can see, this one has been chewed up a few times by a few muskie and pike. So they're great baits. They do make a bigger size than this, 10 or 9.5 inches. They also have a 12-inch one. You don't generally need it if you're just getting started. That's a great bait to have. Another bait that I'd recommend is a big spinner bait. Now, a lot of people talk about bucktails. Bucktails are great. Here's one right here. This is a 8/8 bucktail. Really good baits. If you fish around a lot of rocks, these are great. If you fish around a lot of weeds, I'd recommend getting a spinnerbait. Andrew caught one of his biggest muskies ever on a spinnerbait. This is a Blockfly Lures pike and muskie taker. I think it's like an ounce and 3/4, maybe 2 ounces, something like that. It's not huge. You can chuck this on, medium heavy musky rod. It fishes through weeds really good, and it does catch big muskie. You don't have to use giant lures to catch muskie. Most of Andrew's, biggest muskie he's caught on just, I'd say, like big bass lures pretty much.
Yeah. And
so
and I've been able to fish them effectively on a swim bait rod, just because of the smaller size lure and the hooks aren't those like full gauge musky hooks.
Yeah.
But as soon as you try and cast something that has those, you're going to need a stiffer rod.
Yeah. So don't go crazy. You don't need anything crazy. I'd say if you have a spinner bait, a swim bait, and then I'd get like a plopper. This is a Suakinite walker, or just like a really big whopper plopper. You'll be set. And just the thing is with musky fishing, like Andrew said, you sometimes fish for hours or days without seeing anything. Our advice would be find some good areas that are near weed lines, near deep water. You have to think fish like to feed in the weeds, but then they also like the ability to hide deep when they have to. So find some good weed edges near deep water, and then cast whatever of these baits works the best in that area. Say if you're fishing and the weeds are a bit thick, chuck the spinner bait. If the weeds come almost up to the top of the surface, chuck the top water, goes right over top. And if you have to fish deeper, chuck out that swim bait and let it sink down, and just keep at it, and eventually you'll get one. They're not easy fish to catch just because there's not a lot of them. So just keep at it. You will catch your first one this fall for sure. And fall is a great time because the fish start feeding up for the winter. So here's a good question from Jason, who's a Patreon member. He says he's interested more in September fishing tips. So he has 3 questions. Normally we only answer one, but we like Jason, so we'll answer 3 of them. So the first one is, what's your favorite species to target in September? Well, pretty much muskie.
Yeah, muskie's fun. I also really like smallmouth.
Yes.
Smallmouth, they can get chunky. Because they're putting on that big feed. And they, even in the slightly colder waters, it's still like warm temperatures because it's still in the summer, just petering off. They can still be super aggressive in those water temperatures.
I'd say September is probably one of my favorite months for smallmouth fishing.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of fish are really good to catch in September. Like September's a great month.
I love crankbait bites for smallmouth. September is a great month to start casting some crankbaits.
Yeah. And with musky fishing, September is when you get that first cool down, usually late August. And by September, a lot of those fish start transitioning. The fish that are in deeper water during the summer, because they like to be cool, they start coming back shallow because the water starts getting a little bit, more to their liking, and they start feeding up for the winter. So you can catch giant muskie close to shore. So that's what I would say. His second question is, what is your favorite setup for each? So I'll handle the muskie, you handle the smallmouth. What's your favorite setup for that?
Favorite setup for the smallmouth is probably a medium action spinning rod. Maybe medium heavy if there are some weeds around and I want to cast like a chatterbait or something slightly less or more weedless, like a mini max or something. But usually a medium action spinning rod with 15-pound braid with a shock leader on front of some fluoro, maybe 10-pound fluoro or 8-pound fluoro, and that's again very classic. I have been fishing a lot on the BFS. That's not everyone needs that. I have it and I love using it. So I really like fishing my BFS on my old Babazumi Shimano crankbait rod that Jesse gave me. That thing is, I love it. It's fun to be able to use a bait caster while fishing crankbaits. A little bit less line twist, and I find it doesn't get tangled as easily. But again, spinning rod, you can't go wrong with it either, and that's normally what I'll target for them. Even topwater, going topwater fishing for smallmouth, they'll still come up and feed. Again, it's not crazy cold temperatures yet, and I find like minnow presentations, like topwater minnow presentations, are really effective.
For sure, yeah. And as for musky fishing, again, it really depends what you're chucking, right? So, for example, if you're chucking, like a Shadzilla Junior, like we're talking, it weighs like 2.5 ounces, your rod's going to be completely different than if you're, chucking something a bit bigger, right? Like this is like a bigger Chaos Tackle swim bait that weighs 7 ounces, right? So I'd say overall, in my experience so far, I have a few musky rods. I'd say the most versatile rod for September is just a heavy, an 8.5 to 9 foot heavy power rod Like I have a St. Croix Mojo Musky 8.6 heavy, and I can chuck almost anything on that rod. It's just a versatile rod. You can chuck baits, up to 6-7 ounces if you need to, but it'll also cast stuff that's like 2 ounces. So you want to have a rod that's, versatile. You don't have to worry about, is it heavy enough? Like Andrew, for a while, he was using a swim bait rod. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much like a medium light musky rod. But at the same time, that's great for smaller stuff, but it kind of eliminates anything bigger. Like if he wanted to chuck like a 4-ounce tube, which isn't really a big musky bait at all, he couldn't. And even if he could cast it out and a muskie grabbed it, he wouldn't have the power to get those thick gauge hooks into the fish's mouth. So you want something a bit stiffer. I'd say a heavy is a great rod. And I'd recommend, if you're just getting into musky fishing, there's lots of nice budget musky rods. For instance, the Daiwa Pro Rex XTs are $130. Saw them on sale all the time for less than $100. You could also, look at St. Croix. Andrew has that Triumph musky rod. I think they're about $170.
I think so, around there.
Yeah, a little bit better quality, but you don't have to spend a lot of money. There's a lot of options now under $150.
So some of the Shimano rods will go on sale too. Like I have a Shimano Compre. I got a crazy deal because it was returned and then on sale on top of that. So I think I paid like $60 for it. But like that's cheap. But normally I think they run just over 200, somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
50. But again, you can usually get them. Oftentimes Shimano stuff for the bigger brands, they'll go on sale. It'll be like 30% off or 40% off. Anything in this for this brand. So you can pick it up then and save a bit of money.
Definitely. So we're going to do one more question for this episode. And this is a good one. This is from Kevin from Patreon. And he says, "Hey guys, first off, love the podcast. Been listening for a long time now. Love listening on my way to work Monday mornings." Mondays are terrible, right, Andrew? It's always nice to listen to a good podcast on the way to work on Monday. Like I don't listen to our own podcast on Monday because that'd be weird. But
I do.
Oh, Andrew's a weirdo.
That's the only good part about, we're recording this on a Monday. And that was the only pretty much good part about today. Today was bad. I didn't like today.
So anyway, Kevin continues. He says, "As for the question, I was wondering if you guys have any superstitions before or after a fishing trip." So
I have one. And it's not a superstition. It's just, I don't like forgetting my gear. So I have a checklist I have to go over and over. And I go sit in the car and I sit there and I'm like, all right, we have rods. Okay. I have the baits that I can cast on those rods. I have the gear to land a fish. And I kind of walk through like what I'm hoping the day will entail. Will I have the stuff to do that? Okay, good. Then I can go.
That's not a superstition. That's called not being an idiot.
Yeah, but I struggle with that, Jesse.
I know. So I thought we could talk briefly about some of the superstitions. Like if you're just getting into fishing, you may not know this, but a lot of fishermen, it's widely known. We did a whole episode actually on, superstitions that anglers have last year. I'll link that below in the show notes. You can listen to that episode. It's pretty interesting. Andrew goes into all these fishing lore and superstitions that anglers have and like how they came about years and years ago. So one of the most popular ones is bananas on the boat bring bad luck. A lot of people will freak out if you have a banana in your lunch bag and you're fishing because they think it's bad luck. And it all goes back to the origin. I know, Andrew, back in that episode, there was like 3 or 4 different possible origins, but one of them is that it stems from the fact that bananas can spoil quickly and attract insects. And back in the day when they were transporting bananas through the ocean on these ships, that was bad because it got people diseases and unhealthy and people got sick and died.
And if bananas spoil quicker, they would spoil any other produce that's also being shipped at the same time.
Yeah. So we clearly see that bad bananas spoiling and attracting insects is terrible for the modern angler. That's why people are superstitious about it. So another one that I think is more common than people think is people having like a lucky fishing hat. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you have I don't have a lucky fishing hat. I have hats that I like. I'm like, okay, this is my fishing hat. But some people are obsessed. Like you see their hat, it's all ratty and it looks like it's been sweated through a million times and it's just like so faded. And they're like, this is my lucky fishing hat. And if I don't wear it, I won't catch anything. A lot of people view that, right? And they fear that if they wash it, it washes away all the luck and they won't catch any fish. Who knows? I'd say one other one that I've heard from a lot of people, I remember first hearing about it when I was fishing with this guy and we were doing a little buddies tournament. And his first cast of the day, he kind of like shot a weird cast to the side and reeled it in really quick. And he's like, oh, it's bad luck to catch a fish on your first cast. And I was like, really? And he's like, oh, yeah. I always cast to the side of the boat and reeled in really fast, right? So I've never heard that before. So I was like, okay. But apparently a lot of people think that if you catch a fish on your first cast, the rest of your day will be doomed. You won't catch any fish. So I don't personally think that, but I kind of have this one that I do is whenever I buy a new fishing rod, which happens all the time, unfortunately, I always say, if I don't catch a fish on the rod the first time I use it, that rod is cursed. And thankfully, a lot of the rods that I use all the time, I'll catch fish. I'll purposely save them for trips where I know I'm going to catch fish. Not that it means anything, but I just think it's funny. But the only problem with that is, generally speaking, musky rods are generally always cursed because you never catch any musky. So
it can be tough to get the skunk off some of those rods for sure.
Oh man, it takes a while. But once you catch a good fish on it, it's not cursed anymore. That's just my own little weird superstition that's not a superstition. So anyway, we are at the halfway point on this episode. So like we mentioned before, we have a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. We're going to go in depth on them, but we're actually going to save the other half for our part 2. And our part 2 is going to be next week, of course. So we're going to end this episode now. And we're going to end this with, as tradition states, the quote of the week. And to handle that, we have the man with the overflowing mustache, Andrew.
I think it's a good rule of thumb. Don't eat fish organs.
Shouldn't be too hard.